Today I'm joined by R.G. Price. He is the author of Deciphering the Gospels Proves Jesus Never Existed.
Many theologians, they start trying to define Jesus sometimes, where people start saying, well, but maybe Jesus was an unknown person that didn't do this and didn't do that, and he didn't do anything described in the Gospels, and he said nothing. And, like at a certain point, it becomes irrelevant, right? But the point is, we can prove that the figure described in the Gospels did not exist, or we can prove that the gospel character is not based on a real person, that gospel character is a fictional character, and the description of those events, the sayings, all of those things that supposedly happened, those things did not happen. So we can prove that the gospel narrative is fictional and they do not describe the life of a real person. And at that point, I would say that the gospel Jesus did not exist, right? What I show in the book is that all of these scenes are completely derived from the Jewish scriptures, and that's not the way historical accounts happen. People don't write down things that are word for word parallels of other scriptures. And so, if every single account of the crucifixion that we have, every single description of what happened at the crucifixion is entirely based on references to Jewish scriptures, primarily, like I show in the book, Psalm 22, where the details about, casting lots for his clothing and what he says when he's on the cross and people shaking their heads at him, all of this stuff. That's not the way history is recorded.
When you look at Paul's Jesus is lacking, obviously, a lot of the details of that, nearly all the details the Gospels describe Jesus. Look at Paul's Jesus. What do you think is going on with Jesus in Paul's letters?
My current assessment of what's going on in the Pauline letters in the second century, the early apologists saying that Marcion, who was a sort of Gnostic figure, was a heretic who had made a copy of the Gospel of Luke and truncated parts of it, cut out things that he didn't like. A lot of new scholarship shows that that's not what happened, that actually the Gospel of Luke is derivative of Marcion's Gospel, and that the birth story and the ending of Luke were essentially added on to the Marcionite Gospel. Once we recognize that, what that tells us is the body of New Testament literature that we have, this Orthodox version, really was produced in reaction to Marcionism in the second century. And that, you mentioned Timothy, that's one of the pastorals. None of those existed in the Marcionite letters, or those three were added on later. And certainly revisions were made throughout the Pauline letters to modify them in ways that brought them in line with a more what became Orthodox thinking in opposition to Marcionite thinking. And one of the big examples is the introduction to the letter to the Romans. It talks about Jesus being born from David and all of this stuff. Those are things that were not present in the originals or in the earlier versions. So the idea that we can take the Pauline letters, look at them and say, oh, look, the Pauline letters say this, therefore that must be true. That just simply isn't the case, because these letters have been through multiple revisions by multiple different ideologues probably in the first century, definitely in the second century, like the statements in 1 Corinthians 15, where it talks about Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus being seen by Peter and James and all those people. That, I believe, is all later interpolation. What do I think the original person who wrote these letters that we call the Pauline letters was thinking when they talked about Jesus? Well, Judaism really is derived from Israelite and Canaanite. All the evidence shows that every artifact and every bit of archaeological evidence we can find indicates, and we're still worshiping multiple gods. And we know that El, or El Elyon, was the father, the highest God, who was seen as the father of all the other gods, and that Yahweh was a son of God, and Yahweh was one of the many sons of God, but he was the son of God that was, dedicated to Israel. He was the sort of protector of Israel. And that the way the Jewish scriptures are created is really by sort of making an amalgam of stories about El and Yahweh and combining these two figures into a single deity. The Pauline letters that we have are very likely derived from Marcion's letters, even though they didn't view Jesus as a real person, that he was a spiritual being that descended from heaven. It was certainly a narrative about a figure that actually existed on earth, a spiritual figure that existed on earth at a certain time and did certain things. And I think that those heretics are actually likely the ones that popularized the gospel story. We know that Marcion was the first person to produce a written New Testament that he called a New Testament, and was evangelizing it, and was the main evangelizer in Asia Minor, which was, essentially Turkey and parts of Greece and stuff like that. And this is really where sort of the Pauline ministry supposedly happened. And, I think it's important to understand what the proto-Orthodox apologists were saying in the second and third centuries. The history that they laid out basically was this. According to what's essentially in the New Testament and other information, they said, well, Jesus came along, he did his thing. Afterwards, as Acts of the Apostles tells us, his disciples went and they spread true, pure Christianity throughout the Greek speaking world, basically, what they thought happened. And the Gnostic heretics come in, these Gnostic antichrists, and they start confusing everybody. And the Gnostics misrepresent the teachings of Jesus, and they tell a bunch of lies, and they get everybody all confused. And so there's this period, this dark period, at the end of the first century through the beginning of the second century, a period of almost 60 or 70 years, according to, like a history like of what Irenaeus throws out, where Christianity goes into this dark phase and it's overtaken by the Gnostics, and they're teaching all of this crazy stuff. And so what Irenaeus and the other apologists from the second and third century say is, we came into possession of the authentic writings of the apostles. So we have these four gospels. They somehow come upon this collection of writings, and this collection of writings is what saves Christianity. And Acts of the Apostles tells us about the history of Christianity prior to the Gnostic destruction of Christianity, and that, thank God we came into possession of these writings that then now allows us to see the truth so that we can save Christianity from the Gnostic heretics. And that sort of was the accepted history of the origins of Christianity, has been accepted for 2,000 years of. But what appears to really have happened is that all that stuff described by Acts of the Apostles is a fabricated, later fictional mythologizing of what happened. There was no pre-Gnostic era. The pre-Gnostic era, apostolic era, never existed. That's a later invention that was created in the mid-second century.